Welcome to the Plato lecture on 201. I'll ask everybody to put their phones away. I see some friends in the front row. They know me well, so no issues. Sorry, the microphone? Okay, that's good. So airplane mode would be much appreciated. All right, so let me just jump right into this. Plato's Republic is a work of the 4th century BC, before the Common Era, before Christ. The work is famous for its discussion of justice, of the timeless forms or ideas, Plato's ideas, as we'll explore in the duration, as well as the notion of the philosopher king. Right? We'll get to that. My attention today is to focus primarily on Plato's defense of an ethical theory of justice against Thrasymachus, the rebellious Thrasymachus, and the philosophical and political enterprises Plato finds himself getting into to defend such a theory of justice. I argue that to study the Republic solely in terms of either its political or its philosophical lessons is not really to see the whole picture here. In fact, I go as far as to say that wherever philosophy is, there too is politics, and vice versa. That is, our political values color our philosophical understandings of the world. It's a little bit too much microphone. Our philosophical values color our political values, and our political values influence our philosophical, our thinking, our theory of truth, of reality. And they have implications for each other, the philosophical and the political. That's the basic notion, and that's why I'm going beyond what you'll read in class, which is more of an emphasis on the cave and the forms. I'm going to give you an overview of the totality with an emphasis on the cave and the forms, and I'm also going to look at how that is part and parcel of a larger political project that is, for me, the launching pad for the Republic itself. Again, this interconnectedness between philosophy or metaphysics on one side and politics on the other, nowhere is this more true than on the pages of the Republic, where the whole venture into philosophy, as we will see, is launched by a crisis of political and historical conscience on the part of the author of Plato. Before I jump into the dialogue itself, it is important to set the context of the debate. On the one hand, we have the sophists on the left corner, who, like the rebellious Thrasymachus of the Republic, believe that there is no truth except what we humans make, and that democracy allows each to express their own truth. On the other hand, on the other side of this debate, are those like Plato, who argue for a permanent realm of ideas, providing a standard of truth anywhere and at any time, which can only be understood and applied by a philosophical elite, right? So how do you get your political values? You get them from philosophy. With this, we have introduced the two camps of the sophists and the Platonics, Thrasymachus with the sophists, Plato certainly with the Platonics by definition, and we may here begin our descent into the dialogue. At the end of the day, we can look at the Republic as a whole, as a theory of an ideal political community, or polis, as they called it, based on a version of justice, and we can judge its worth from this point of view. Plato's spokesman in the dialogue, Socrates, you may or may not know the name, was actually his real-life teacher, Plato's teacher, and as we will see, his teacher's life, Socrates' life and death, had a great influence on Plato's theory of truth, justice, and power, as it is at least presented in the Republic. It is Thrasymachus' challenge which largely sets the stage for the Republic. He argues that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, that might makes right, that justice is a lie or a myth fabricated by the powerful to justify the status quo. Thrasymachus' position is rejected by Plato, Plato's primary spokesman in the dialogue, as mentioned, Socrates, who argues that the art of rulership never takes the interest of the ruler as primary. By definition, a ruler doesn't rule for himself or herself, but in the interest of the ruled. Despite his refutation of Thrasymachus' position, Socrates has yet to provide a positive definition of justice, and hereon, from book one onwards, he sets out to find one. With this, the real and central work of the Republic has begun. Socrates and his main discussants, students as well, Glaucon and Adeimantus, agree to take up this search with Socrates through the dialogue. They agree to search for justice first at the macro level, the giant level of the state, and only afterwards to look for justice in the individual, the micro level. This deductive procedure seeks the individual through the lens of the larger body politics and is oriented, as we will see repeated again and again as a kind of ongoing theme in Plato, it is oriented towards viewing the part as part of the whole, right? The whole is primary. Socrates moves towards an understanding of justice considered aside from its rewards, with a view to the essential good and evil which justice and injustice work in the possessors of them. How does it affect the individual when they choose to be unjust or to be just? Thus, Socrates and his friends set out to prove that justice is not only best for the happiness it brings about, but also best in and of itself, regardless of its consequences. And this begins their inquiry into the ideal form of the state. What should that perfect state look like? Socrates starts by laying out the economic organization necessary for the state exists. He starts at its very basic foundations. He lays out the divisions of labor, which he holds as the conditions of life necessary to allow a community to flourish. Merchants, workers, buyers all interact to provide the variety of goods available and necessary for life. Each type of labor must be performed by those whose natures are best fit to perform it, such that the division of labor most effectively utilizes its human resources, that of the citizens. As the city's needs and wants expand into a city of unlimited desires, or what one of the members of the dialogue called a city of pigs, there will be a demand for an expansion of lands in order to provide for growing wants and luxury, right? The city can't resolve all of its needs. It needs to look further afield to perhaps invade its neighbors. With this, Socrates informs them that they have discovered war to be derived from the causes which also are the causes of almost all the evils in the state, private as well as public. Desire, greed, and envy are the first foundations of evil for any city. From these beginnings, the search for justice in the state, the harmonization of differences and the suppression of conflict are taken as constitutional principles of political order for Plato. He is no liberal, he is no Democrat. Unity, not diversity, appears to be Plato's primary concern. And I think that we're going to see this as a thematic continuity throughout the dialogue. To the end of material and territorial expansion, a place of military training becomes necessary, and the division of labor is again expanded to supply those who will fill out the army. Socrates turns to the analogy of the courage of dogs as epitomizing spirit and bravery, in order to imagine a class of soldiers who will prove dangerous to enemies and soft and warm to friends. The most fitting education for the soldiers, Socrates finds in a regimen, a training of music and gymnastics. A strong program of censorship as well, censorship, is set up in order to encourage some themes and to repress others. Right? All harmful examples of passion, irrationality, or cowardice that are in the myths or in the poems are to be eliminated from the education of the youth, who will become the brave defenders of the polis. The state may produce myths, and the rulers censor and lie, but the poets and the myth makers will follow suit. Plato now pushes the dialogue onward to ask the primary political question: who shall rule? He begins his search for the best rulers in holding that the best amongst the old, right, the aged, must rule the young. The elite should be for the common people, but not of the common people. At this point, Plato fashions his political myth or noble lie of the earth-born castes, his myth of the metals. Here, the youth must be taught that their training, all youth, must be taught that their training and education as children took place in the earth. And that this experience has given them a particular metallurgic quality. They were either bronze, silver, or gold. And that the Greek soil from which they were born is their true mother, to be loved and defended against enemies. This identification, or the identification with a class of metals, dictates a citizen's rank in society and their political status for the rest of their life. The purity of these castes is to be guarded for Plato, as there, quote, there is nothing which they should so anxiously guard as the purity of the race, right? So a caste system. The highest ranks of the guardians find their purpose in the production of the constitution, which takes as its primary purpose not the disproportionate happiness of any one class, but the greatest happiness of the whole, right? We have a polis family or a city family being organized by Plato. At this point in his development, Plato is working up the basics of his city, of his state, from its foundations. In starting at the level of appetite, desire, with material production and consumption, Plato first addressed his city in its lowest aspect first. That is, he works towards the ideal of justice from the lowest levels of material exchange and human appetite. Now, with the education and role of the warrior class, the army, the military, he has moved upwards from appetite to the working, from the level of appetite and the working classes to a higher level of the military, which represents the passions, right? Passion and emotion or spirit. In contemplating his four highest virtues, courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, explain a little bit more what those mean. Socrates declares justice to be discovered in the divisions of the state. Justice is seen here in the differentiation of the city, this division of labor that we discussed. Justice and the separation of the citizens into their specialized task, right? Famously, justice is each part doing what it does well, right? The beehive comes to mind. In terms of class functioning, this means the laboring class obeying, the brave warriors defending, and the wise guardians at the top ruling. Each of these in harmony with the other, creating the overall good of the whole, of the organism, right? The political organism. Having found justice in the state, Socrates now returns to the question of justice in the individual. We've seen it in the state, and now we're going to move to find justice at the individual level within the soul. To begin, Socrates moves to articulate the structures of the soul. These structures, which he claims make up any person, right? The three classes found in the state, right? The workers, the banausic class, the workers, the military, and the ruling class, here have an equivalence at the level of the soul and are translated into the appetites, the emotions, and the intellect, or the animal, the emotional, and the intellectual at the very highest level. As the just state goes, so goes the individual. It will not cheat, not lie, nor steal, so long as each part functions to carry out its own proper business, unimpeded, right, and in harmony with its counterparts, right? He says it is only with the meddlesomeness and interference of the inferior part in the rising up of any part of the soul against the whole, right? A cancer of the political, the body politic, you might say, rising up against a part of the soul that the soul is rendered into corruption and deformity. Each part has to accept its role, its rank, and its station. Otherwise, the whole thing falls into a mess. Justice in the soul, as in the state, means that each part of him or her is doing its own business, whether in being ruled or ruling. With this, Socrates declares that Thrasymachus's equation of domination with strength, remember Thrasymachus, might makes right, justice is the advantage of the stronger. With this, Socrates declares that Thrasymachus's equation of domination with strength, right, of justice with power, right, and happiness has been defeated, as it serves no one to be miserable and sickly either of body or of soul. The soul of the just must find within himself or herself, right, a harmony, right? And if any part is out of place, the whole is imbalanced and misery is the result. In response to his colleagues' insistence, right, insistence at this point of the dialogue, they now return to the question of the state. They think that this is very interesting and they want to pursue this further. Has Socrates really discovered a new vision of an ideal city, right? Declaring the issue of class conflict to be resolved, right, he says that where all are of one opinion about what is near and dear to them, they all tend towards one opinion, right? No more conflict in the city. Everybody agrees about what really matters. With this, Glaucon moves to ask Socrates how he has actually made the case that their ideal state is actually possible given what we know of human history and human nature, right? Everybody says, your ideals are beautiful for the mind and on paper, but how can we make that possible given the messiness of the world we see around us, our experience, and what often people point to as human nature, right? With this, the quintessential, the central question of the Platonic dialogue has arrived. Here we begin to fathom, to think about the interaction of the timeless universal ideal, right, these perfect ideas, the ideal of the good on the one side, and its historical manifestations or forms of justice on the other. That is, how do we make compatible, right, the perfect ideal of the city with the real world we live within, right, the real and the ideal. With so much of the life and ordering of the polis family already described at this point, some of which I've left out in terms of the common holding of wives, right? Wives for Plato should be held in common, right? Communism of property for Plato, and the organization of mating, which he's very elaborate about. What has arrived in the dialogue is a consideration of the viability, right, of the ideal state. Does its status as an ideal make it a historical impossibility? Is there a conflict between his ideal city and the real world such that Plato's idea is really foolish and not something we can really accomplish? That is, ultimately, to what universal and timeless map can the mind, can reason refer in order to plot the good political course, to navigate the good political course through history as Plato aspires to? It is the metaphysical question, right? Metaphysics, the question of what really is, right? The metaphysical question of the conceptual foundations of justice for the Plato, for the polis, that Plato now has to develop and to convince us of. The interplay of the real and the ideal, what Socrates calls in the Republic the third wave, the greatest wave, is now something that Plato tackles. How do we make the ideal city something that's feasible, right? The prophet has his revelation. How do we, right, bring that revelation down to earth and make it practical, right? That's I think the right term. History is clearly in rebellion against the realization of his idealistic words and dreams, right? Plato's words and dreams. Nevertheless, he claims that just because such a state has never existed does not mean that it is not an ideal. And if it is an ideal, right, clearly it ought to be possible, right? Conditional upon this great wave of political transformation being brought about, Plato makes one of his most famous claims through Socrates' mouth. Until philosophers are kings, and political greatness and wisdom, philosophical wisdom, meet in one, cities will never have rest from their evils, right? With this bold statement, Plato makes the philosophical conditions for his political program clear. It is the disclosure of the ideal through the philosopher's political authorship or prophetship, with which Plato seeks to establish true political authority and make it concrete, practical in the real world. Plato here sounds his endorsement of the rule of a philosopher class over the commoner natures, the normal people, who are destined to be ruled. There are those who will rule and those who will be ruled, right? And they will not be the same people. Against the real world politicians and sophists who think only of reputation, only of persuasion, and only of wealth, sounds familiar, Plato presents a philosopher who keeps his gaze upon the permanent realm of ideas and is interested only in truth, only in what is right, right? Right makes might, not the other way around, right? Power should come from virtue. The rule of the universal idea is made the model for the correct ordering of the polis. As such, the rule of these philosophical few, this elite, this guardianship, requires Plato to delve into a philosophical defense of truth and its basis in the perfect ideas that he is famously known for calling the ideal forms. Though the theory of the forms are at play here, they're being talked about, the outlines of such a theory remain wholly beyond the bounds of the text so far. We really don't know where they are or how to know about them. This stage of the dialogue reveals a dramatic ascendance, an elevation, from the allegorical or metaphorical language of appearances, right, the realm of the senses, towards Plato's language of science of dialectic, the science of the mind. That is, he's moved us through the dialogue from the world of the senses, from the world of tradition, right, to the world of the intellect and the philosophical, right, from that which changes to that which is unchanging. Such a progression in the text mirrors the liberation of the mind, which will be witnessed in the upcoming allegory of the cave, the story of the cave. The moment has arrived to describe the true nature of the philosophical practice in terms of its innermost in idea and content. What does it mean to be a philosopher, right? We need to know that in order to understand how these guys can and should rule. A second educational program is now begun, which Plato bases on his central metaphysical or philosophical scheme or theory of reality, right? Metaphysics being a theory of reality in the Republic. The doctrine of the ideal forms that we've been talking about. The ultimate unity of the system of ideas or forms, as will be examined, becomes the essence or central ruling principle for the city's political architecture and educational system. Right? He's going to use these ideal forms, these ideas, these timeless ideas, as a political map, right, with which to reform the city, the real city. Yet, as Adamantus, one of the members of the dialogue, brings out at this point, the problem remains as to how the ideal may be made to replace the corrupt Athenian, right? I don't want to say Lebanese or global, but the corrupt Athenian reality and the poverty of democracy for which Plato has become such a famous witness. That is, how can we come to know and realize the ideal when there is so much resistance to it in the real world of corruption, common sense, hedonism, right, the pursuit of pleasure, and political practice, right? How can we make this real? The world doesn't seem ready for these high ideas, right? The world seems motivated by other, right, priorities. To answer this, Plato turns to develop a theory of knowledge and ideas in order to establish the philosophical method that his guardians can use to rule. First, through access to the universal ideas, and then by translating them into political practice. And here we come to, remember, we're starting at the bottom and moving up, the divided line. And that the lowest levels of the line are the realm of the senses, of convention, of tradition, and imagination, and these are the world of illusion. At the highest point of the line is metaphysical, dialectic, or rational knowing, which is seen without the senses, with no reference to the senses, as the pure ideas of the mind that only the mind can know and which are timeless and unchanging, right? Everything at the bottom is fleeting. It has no permanence, and it should not be trusted. For him, politics in his day, and perhaps in our day, is ruled by the lowest realms of the imagination and the senses. He wants to invert that and make the world of being, of reason, of the intellect, right, the ruling principle for political judgment. Here, Plato delivers his theory of the divided line, which lays out a hierarchy of the intelligible and sensible worlds, right? At the top, the world which can be known only with the mind, and at the bottom, that which is known with the senses. Plato's line is divided by function as well. On the lower part, the visible world is divided into belief and imagination at the very lowest level, right? And on the upper half of the upper 1/3, right? The intelligible is divided into the realm of mathematics, right? Which still makes reference to the world, and then ultimately to pure knowing, to pure ideas at the very highest level, which makes no reference to the real world whatsoever. It's ideas and thinking working with pure ideas and thought alone. At this highest level of reasoning, thinking works with pure ideas to acquire truth of the whole and the highest idea of the good, right? The highest truth is an ethical truth for Plato, right? The highest idea is that of the good itself. Reason or dialectic brings together all parts of experience into the one truth of being, and in the political realm into the state which unifies all citizens, right? Only at the highest level of reason can we see unity. And that model of unity is something that Plato will translate into a model of unity for the city, right? So metaphysics and philosophy is the only microscope or telescope or optic with which we can see the truth of the whole. It can never be seen with the senses. And as long as politics is ruled by the senses, we'll have nothing but chaos, messiness and turbulence. He wants to bring an end to that. And turbulence and chaos in the world of politics means disorder, it means conflict, it means violence for Plato, and ultimately civil war and strife. And that is ultimately what Plato's up against. He wants to bring peace and harmony to his time, to his fellow citizens. This knowledge of the highest idea is grounded on the ultimate principle earlier discussed, the good, right? From this highest point of reference, thinking may once again descend to the lower levels of experience in order to bring order to the diversity of phenomena, diversity of data of the senses. This hierarchy of understanding is built up on 4 levels to which Plato assigns 4 mental faculties, which descend in the following order. We've already talked about this, really. Reason is at the level of pure ideas, right? Good being an example. Intellect at the level of mathematics, where numbers and shapes are analyzed. Belief at the level of raw sensory experience, right? What we see, what we experience sensually. And at the lowest level, imagination, which is nothing but a reflection of experience at the very lowest level, right? Thus, at the highest level, knowing is understood with the mind alone. The senses must be shut off. To see with the mind, we must close the eyes. And at the lowest, we are in the realm of imagination. Okay. If the line then divides true knowledge from false opinion, how do we apply this to the realm of politics, and what does it mean for justice? Socrates speaks of a progress of consciousness, a development of the mind, through which philosophical understanding may take a foothold, may place a foot down in the real world, and begin the process of bringing the heavenly ideal of justice down for political realization, implementation. Thus, the famous allegory of the cave, which we just went through, is an ideological, describes the ideological and social conditions within which human consciousness is held captive and develops. Right? And ultimately is diverted, deflected, perverted from seeing the truth because we're really held hostage to the lower levels of the line. The divided line provides Plato with a ladder, right? You can think about this as a ladder for freedom, for freedom of the mind, and ultimately to free the city, right? And is a ladder to imagine the liberation of the captives of the cave, right? Which we're about to explore by bringing them to the light of the truth, which is visible with reason, right? So let us move on to the cave, which in a way is a direct reflection of the way the world works in terms of the divided line. We have the prisoners at the bottom and the philosopher who's escaped through reason to see the true light of being, right? Now let me explain how this works. What's important is that the lowest form of mental experiences with the prisoners being held within the cave, and the highest reason is the philosopher who has escaped the cave. And the cave can be looked at as in terms of the senses, in terms of social convention, social conformity, and ultimately tradition, and I think that kind of covers history, the way we're captives to history. In Plato's cave, in society, as he then saw it and would probably see it now, humans unknowingly carry out underground, subterranean lives in the deep and dark of the cave. Their arms and heads are bound, and their gazes are fixed, forced forward upon a wall which have shadows cast upon them, right? And to cast these shadows, there are puppets being used, right, behind light, which cast those shadows. It's kind of a puppet play, shadow puppets. A group of presenters create these shadows by manipulating objects and puppets between a bright fire and the wall where the shadows fall, a little bit like television. For the audience, the shadows cast on the wall are taken as true reality. The prisoner sees this puppet show as the real. Voices are projected into the cinema in association with the shadow images and are taken to come from the shadow objects themselves, right? These shadows take on a life and become the real reality for the viewers. This social and sensory indoctrination, right? Indoctrination, education, amounts to the world of nurture and would perhaps be best represented by education, law, art, today, media, such as this individual checking her Facebook over there. Tradition and other social and political institutions which form our collectively held worldviews. Even when released from this captivity to custom, convention, and sense, to trends, the prisoners refuse to give up the lessons of their previous captivity. They want to believe what they see on television. They want to believe that Trump or Hillary Clinton are really telling them the truth. Most people. Should these same captives be finally dragged out of the cave and into the direct light of the sun and made to look into the sun being the light of truth, they would be blinded and go mad. For those who escape the limits of the cave, their new point of reference will take time to adjust to and finally embrace. They have to get used to the brightness of the truth, right? Through reason, right? Slowly they will come to see the light of day, the truth of being, without discomfort. They naturally come to understand its primacy, right? The importance of truth for not merely for understanding of the world, but for political judgment as well, right? So it's a philosophical program that is ultimately translatable into a political one. Having come to this startling escape, the philosopher outside the cave, the newly liberated person now sets their sight upon returning to the cave. They have to go back in. Such a return to the cave, Plato warns, would be laughed at as ridiculous and denounced as heretical, heresy, right? Unorthodox, a challenge to the norms, by virtue of the philosopher's threat to the order of custom and tradition, right? Such a mission, Plato makes clear, would likely end in the philosopher's death, who would clearly be treated as a revolutionary or a terrorist, right? An enemy of the state, threatening the status quo. Clearly, Plato had not forgotten the lesson of his teacher's plight, Socrates, who was sentenced to death for his unorthodox, his heterodox teachings. And that is, of course, the Socrates of the Republic himself. In Plato's city, then, of course, the real-world Socrates is dead when Plato is writing this dialogue. In Plato's ideal city, then, the statesman requires this ultimate knowledge, the politician requires this ultimate knowledge of the idea of the good in order to be capable of rational political judgment. Being a businessman or an engineer or a doctor is not sufficient. You must learn the queen of the sciences, philosophy. In having read the imprint of eternal truth in the final idea of the good, the highest idea, through reason, the philosopher now returns to the cave of the polis with a blueprint for its reform and ultimately its perfection. Here the philosopher must rule as king or queen, as the one who has exclusively received the highest education, and Plato makes clear there is no gender discrimination when it comes to being the philosopher ruler or a member of the ruling class. In this way, Plato delivers his justification as to how one who has been reared to the guardian class, right, and has attained the highest happiness of truth, must now be persuaded to give up a comfortable philosophical life and return to the messiness of the cave in order to free their fellows. With this, the true guardian, the true politician, has been found, and Plato considers his case for the practicality of the ideal city, right? It's now something viable. He considers it complete. In conclusion, a few comments and concerns, right? I think we've covered the big chunks of the polis. Let me now close up with a few thoughts that shouldn't take more than 10 or 15 minutes. In fact, that's what we have. Where Thrasymachus started out arguing that rulership is the art of exploiting the ruled, right? Fleecing the sheep, as some would call it. Plato turned this position around to its opposite so that the rulers themselves are always committed to the rule of the forms as an ultimate political authority. The rulers don't rule for their own interests. They rule in the name of the forms under the authority of the forms, right? These highest ideas, the highest of which is the good. In this sense, the philosopher is for Plato as much a political agent as a prophet, conducting the sight of the community up to the light of the sun of ideas through the practice of philosophy and dialectic, right? Of course, they're the only ones that do that, the politicians, the philosophers, and they deliver this set of goods, this set of values to the community, organize the community, and that is a place within which the children, essentially, of the polis exist in harmony, right? There is a paternalism at play here, although I'll say more about that after. The absence of the philosophical rule and the heavenly city of the ideal forms in the real world of history, as we know it, is thus a kind of purgatorial existence, a purgatorial condition for Plato. We're not fully in hell, but we can never reach heaven, and we're always somehow sinking for Plato. Right? This condition witnesses for Plato the tragic alienation of humanity from its own essential nature and spiritual potential, which can only be seen and known with the mind through philosophical practice. We must admit, though, problematically and questionably, that Platonic justice, right, as we see it here, is not attained through the agency or cooperation or consultation of the citizens. Rather, well, Aristotle famously said there are only two types of people, two types of beings in Plato's Republic, Aristotle said, gods and animals. And we'll see why. Right? So, Platonic justice is found at the level of the organization of the polis as a whole and brings citizens, not with their choice, but into conformity with the ideal which few citizens, only the philosophers, truly understand. Only a few can see the meaning of justice. The rest live within it. In this rule of the one of justice over the many of freedom, right? The one over the many, Plato set his city against what he sees as the ugly and inevitable consequences of democratic pluralism. Plato's big enemy is the Democrats, right? Are the liberals, as we would understand it. The realization of the ideal polis is not achieved through an education which takes the individual potentialities of citizens as ends in themselves, right? As modern liberal arts education aspires to, right? Each person's potentials are an end in themselves. This has no value for Plato. From this angle, the citizens seem to exist for the city and not the city for the citizens. This distinction draws a marked line between the most basic presumptions of modern liberal education, as I said it, and Plato's radical concern with the preservation of harmony and the unified soul of the polis, or family, the polis family, one might say. Despite this critical note, Plato's concern was first and foremost with the frequency of strife, civil war, and conflict in his day. Class conflict, certainly. If we were going to try to understand Plato, there is little value in dismissing his political thought in favor of our own. Nonetheless, it is difficult not to see strong class prejudices both in Plato's political thought as well as his philosophical ideas. He does not like the middle class, and he certainly has very little trust or love for the working classes and those that work with their hands. Right? There were very harsh terms that Aristotle and Plato used for describing people that worked with their hands. To bring all this together, the structure and design of the Republic may be seen as a reflection of the revolutionary implications of the allegory of the cave and the hierarchy of knowledge illustrated in the doctrine of the divided line. To bring his ideal down into the world and to transform the world for Plato is a kind of revolutionary project, a revolution. The movement of the dialogue from the conventional sphere of the senses to that of the ideal permanence of ideas reveals a teaching and philosophical strategy behind the work of the dialogue. Plato slowly refocuses our eyes from the historical level of custom and convention, right, the trend of the day, to the ideal horizon of philosophy, that is, from the earthly to the heavenly, from the senses to the mind. The overall build-up from convention to ideal is a reflection of the movement of the soul, right, both in us as well as the students of the Republic. From the movement upwards of the soul, from the appetites to the passions, with perfection finally attained, as unsurprisingly, in the mind. And each of these have a representative class in the polis. The myth of the metals, right, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, secures his hierarchy with greatest concern for class integration and harmony within the polis. Here, caste or station, ranking of the classes, is given a mythological legitimacy where humans are born by nature to a certain level and status or set of duties and class within the city. Thus far within the dialogue, Plato remained within the bounds of conventional Greek values and wisdom and has yet to provide a foundation for his hierarchy, right, in argument. He hasn't provided us with a philosophical justification for the city. The search for an ideal city and of an ideal justice within it necessarily creates the need to justify his educational and class constructs in the first half of the Republic itself. With this, the center of the dialogue makes its appearance at the end, and the second state of the Republic, there are two states he describes, is begun with Plato's plan to found the city on a system of universal and absolute ideas, his forms, which give meaning to all the educational, legal, and economic institutions, and this through the leadership, the guardianship of the philosophers. Thus, the dialogue has fully moved from the low valleys of Greek tradition to the Plato's high mountain of the mind. Plato's protagonist, his hero, Socrates then tackles the greatest challenge to his theory of the just state. What is the ideal ground and form of legitimate authority that only the mind can know? What is this idea of justice, and which we have never historically seen, and which we can certainly not see with the senses? It is not until this moment that the philosopher has played any role in the construction of the city. The philosopher is a latecomer in the story. Only with this philosophical training does the mind arrive at the conflict between what he sees or she sees and the intellectual reality so as to be capable of the perspective needed to witness the true ideas, the forms, which should order the world, the political world. This evolution Plato took as a model for the foundation of an elite philosophical education, which raises the mind from its captivity in the impressions of the senses, and by extension, to ultimately emancipate, to liberate the city as a whole from the wants, interests, and opinions of its many members, which he considered to be a plague, a disease for harmony, right? Riddling it with internal conflict. Where Plato sought to bring the heavenly forms down to earth, right? Philosophical and political legitimacy are intertwined. This is why it's not enough to study simply the cave and the theory of the divided line. He did this in order to bring an end to the purgatory, the crisis of the shifting sands of public opinion and sensory perception, where appearances, the senses, tyrannize over the mind. The senses tyrannize over truth. Plato's grand story of the state, then, is first and foremost a project where political problems are subjected to the remedy, the therapy of philosophical resolution. The two are inseparable, right? Philosophy and politics, for a truly Platonic understanding of the Republic. The cave dwellers, those living in the cave, to which he addressed himself, were his fellow Athenians and Greeks, and the Republic itself becomes the exercise, the educational exercise of a philosopher who has returned to the cave to free his countrymen and women by philosophical means. Plato, then, is here the philosopher who has escaped the cave in the story and who makes his return through the writing and circulation of the dialogue itself. Plato, through writing the dialogue, is doing exactly what he prescribes for the philosophers in the story. They have to come back into the cave. And the Republic is Plato's way of coming back into the cave. We know that Plato made similar attempts to philosophically convert kings in Sicily to his political ideas. These attempts were unsuccessful, and at least on one occasion, Plato was almost put to death. The Republic then seeks to avenge at least two wrongs inflicted on Plato. Firstly, the execution of his revered teacher, who was put to death by poison, for his philosophical views and teachings, right? So-called corrupting the youth. And secondly, the contempt and ignorance of the kings and politicians of his day, who chose power over justice and ignored wisdom for the sake of short-term gain. Sounds a little familiar as well. To close then, final statement, two takeaway questions. One, has Plato really made a persuasive case for his forms? Does he give a skeleton, thumbnail sketch of them, or has he really given us a solid, essential understanding of what they inherently are? That's a debate. Secondly, should we, do we have grounds to accept his political arrangements? With that, thank you very much for your patience and enjoy your Plato sessions. Thank you.